Atlantis had 10 kings. Just as you have 10 toes in Daniel 2, you have the 10 horns in Daniel 7, the 10 kings and horns in Revelation 12, 13, and 17. And just as you have the Club of Rome, which answers into the Committee of 300, and some say into the Council of 33 through the senior level of the order, have the world divided up into 10 groups or empires, just as the United Nations has done that. They're trying to create Francis Bacon's A Rosicrucian. New Atlantis, or the New Age, is the revisiting or the regeneration of that New Age, or Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. It's 1,000-year reign. It's a counterfeit 1,000-year reign in polytheism that they want to bring about before the advent of Jesus coming. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to deceive us. And so expect a counterfeit Armageddon as well.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Ben.
And thank you for joining us yet again. So we have a great show lined up for you guys today. We're going to be speaking with Gary Wayne. More on him in just a second. I'll give him a more proper introduction. But first, I want to share a few things with you guys before we get going. That way you don't have to hear our spiel again after that. So definitely thank you for joining us. If you are catching this live, you're getting a rare experience because after this, you're going to have to wait a few weeks. We're going to have a continuous release schedule. I know this is a new thing for us on our show, which is kind of fun. You guys get to be a part. And if you join us on Rumble or the website or YouTube, you can actually write. We see all of your comments here. We have a chat feed that runs everything in here. So if you guys want to be a part of the show and you want to chat, feel free. We may even get to some of those. And depending on what your questions are or whatever the case is, we may touch upon some of that stuff. But it's a great way for you guys to interact. If you are watching this not now, you're probably not going to see this for about 10, 12 more weeks because that's about how far out we are in our recording schedule now. So definitely exciting to have the opportunity to do this with you guys. So just a few things we wanted to share with you before we get too far into the show today. Okay, here is what you can do actually to help us out. If you want to go and you want to find out the 4 ways that you can help support the show, everything you guys do, sharing with other people, liking, subscribing, doing all those things, really helps out the show. Obviously, we have merchandise. We have a lot of other things too. Being part of this live stream is yet one other thing that you can do to help out and support the show and share with others. So if you actually go to this website right here, thetfhc.com/support, you can actually find out exactly the 4 ways and things that you can do to help support the show. So thank you guys very much. Now, on to our guest today. So we're very excited to have with us Mr. Gary Wayne. So Gary is author, speaker extraordinaire, but we are really going to get focused on a couple different things that he is involved with, which are 2 of his books. We're probably going to be focusing on part 1 of his 2-part book series for the most part today, which is the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. You guys can see up there by him. He has part 1 and part 2. And we're going to do a nice deep dive into Genesis 6 today. And Gary promised us that he's going to be taking us places that maybe we have never gone before.
I'm excited.
So, Gary, thanks so much for joining us, man. We really appreciate you being here. And you're awesome for doing this, brother. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for inviting me to your show, and so happy to be here and so happy to talk to hopefully a new audience, and if not, then with some old friends that might be out there that have heard me before. That's also always good because there's always more questions and always more things to talk about. So yeah, thank you for being here. And I think if people aren't familiar with who I am, I tend to raise a few eyebrows, and that's probably because I'm a Christian contrarian. And what I mean by that is I tend not to believe what somebody says or what somebody says or what they saw unless I can verify it myself. So, and by doing that, I tend to end up standing in a lot of cases against the status quo dogma and doctrine, both inside and outside the church. So I'm kind of naturally swimming upstream all the time, but I've learned to swim pretty well. And and I think what I bring to the table is I connect dots for people in ways that they haven't thought about before. and I start to help make sense of not only the Old Testament, but in the world that we live in, based on where we came from, how we got here, what's going on today, and what's going to happen.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's an interesting thing because, man, you hit so many points there that Ben relate to, Ben and I, and the thing that we were trying to do on this show too. The thing that we have found is we got in and did exactly what you said. And I one of the things that popped in my head instantly when you were saying what you did is we need more contrarians in this world, and we need to stop having people just accept what has been spoon fed to us by the church, because it is so often wrong. And I am still, and I probably will until the day that I'm in the ground, shedding off a lot of, like you said, the bad dogma that I was taught in church. That when I actually go and try to find what the Lord has to say about it, right? What God and Christ have to say about it in the Bible, it is not either in there or it's an extremely polluted version of what is in there. Yeah. So that is definitely the case when we get into Genesis 6. There are a lot of wackadoo theories out there that are absolutely, quite frankly, wrong. And so we're excited to do some of this dive today. So please walk everybody through just kind of quick synopsis of part 1 of Genesis 6 conspiracy, so we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, so the Genesis 6 conspiracy part 1, subtitled How the Descendants of Giants and How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. It is essentially a 6,000-year investigation into what I call in the book the House of Dragon, and go a little bit deeper into that dragon sort of understanding in book 2 as well, of the conspiracy that happened before the flood. That I start with Genesis 6, but it's the conspiracy of the fallen angels to bring down the Adamites and to prevent them from reaching their destination, which is to be resurrected and to become raised up higher than angels. So that's the conspiracy. And the spurious offspring, the offspring of the fallen angels, recorded in Genesis 6, as it records it, that form the Nephilim, or the giants, as it's translated into English as, were created so that the fallen angels don't have to get blood on their hands. And their job was to parade humankind into absolute destruction that it would have been, which is why God intercedes with the flood, or permits the flood, depending on your interpretation of that, to occur. And then this whole thing starts again after the flood and continues through our time. And there's a resolution in the end time to end the reign of the Council of the Gods over the 70 nations of the earth in the end time, and to send those fallen angels to the lake of fire, and to end the terrible ones, their spurious offspring, who are doing their beckoning. And so it's a wide swath through history, and it is a book that shows how the Bible intersects with a worldwide testimony seen through a polytheist lens versus a monotheist lens. Whereas book 2 shows how the world's testimony intersects with the biblical testimony and goes deeper into the Bible than anybody else has done before. So I think book 2 is like book 1 on steroids for Christians. And also I would describe it as, if you like Dr. Heiser, it's Dr. Heiser on steroids. Book 1, if you're not totally familiar with the Bible, is a better place to start, and it gives you a lot more of other perspectives, but it's written from a distinct Christian biases.
Yeah. Can you get into really quick the concept of where some of these alternate theories, what some of the alternate theories are on Genesis 6? I think it's important for us to cover that. And then where they come from and why we know that the proper and correct interpretation is an angelic incursion.
Yeah. So when we look at the interpretation of Genesis 6, there's a lot of interpretations that are sort of misguided. The first thing I want people to understand, that it's written as part of the preamble to the flood story. And it is the context for the flood story. They are the ones who bring about the understanding of the earth being destroyed, or the earth being corrupted, as opposed to the sea. and that the earth is corrupted, as in decay, as the Hebrew word shakath, decay, to spoil, to ruin. And they're the cause of the violence, and not just the violence that they can do through their superior strength, but through the angelic technology that's provided to them. That they would have destroyed that earth by fire, except that that's reserved, according to 2 Peter 3, for the end time. And that there's an intercession, and depending on whether you're reading a polytheist version or a monotheist version, God brings the flood to ensure all the names of the book of life are written, that were written in there from before creation, have an opportunity to leave their names in, as opposed to having it blotted out, which is why there's the intercession. Or in the polytheist version, it's the council of the gods that bring the flood, because of the corruption of the giants, because of the noise of the humans, and a whole bunch of other reasons that are just designed to sort of wipe humankind from the face of the earth. So when we understand that sort of context, the flood takes on a larger, more supernatural sort of understanding, and it helps to explain how we know the sons of God are angels, and in this case, fallen angels, and in this case, watchers, who produced with human females giants, as the KJV Bible translates it, or Nephilim, as some of the other translations define it. And that word Nephil, which is the singular form of Nephilim, I am is the male plural, representing majestic or royal bloodlines, as you take that back to the I am suffix through the languages that I do in book 2 for people. But understand that the definition of that word giant is a tribe of giants, giant, bully, and tyrant. And people will point to the word bully or tyrant and say, well, that's what it means, and so you're using the wrong application. That's half the information. So they're not denying that the other part of the definition isn't giant. They're just focusing in a wedge and a doubt into people, because the churches aren't teaching us enough information. So if we look at that word bull, that's bully, as its root word as bull, and the gods of the pantheon were understood as bulls, or fallen angels, and their offspring were also understood as bulls. So in whether you're looking at the Sumerian texts, whether you're looking at the Ugaritic texts or other texts around the world, that's a common term for the demigods and the gods. And the demigods is defined in polytheism as the offspring of a god and a human male, or a goddess and a human female. And so when we see the bulls of Bashan that's talked about, and particularly when they're surrounding the cross in the book of Psalms, these are the bulls of Mount Hermon. And in the Ugaritic text, the Mount Saphon, where El, parent god, ruled before the flood, and Baal, son of El, rules after the flood. And both create giants. And so when we look at the word tyrant, that goes back to tyrannos as its original word, and Taruanos, as it was known in Anatolian, and were used to describe the giant kings that were understood from a specific bloodline called the Herculides bloodline, from the Cretazens, from Zeus and Alcmene, the human female, and they were called tyrants for their style of rule. So again, it's forming back into the giants. And if you look at Alcmene as a human female, Zeus as an offspring god who produces the giant Hercules, you have the same story that's going on in Genesis 6. Now, from a scriptural perspective, we have Nephilim and Rephaim giants, and it's the Baalim, Baal and Anat after the flood that are going to create the Rephaim, whereas it would be El and Ashtaroth in that pantheon that creates giants before the flood. And so you have a distinction in the giants, and we can get into that a little bit more later, but just in book 1, I introduced the Rephaim. I don't do a lot of distinguishing between them and the Nephilim, but in book 2, I really get into that. So if we understand the fallen angels as the gods of the pantheon, we can now look at a polytheist testimony through a polytheist lens of giants that are created all around the earth that matches perfectly with Genesis 6. Now, a lot of people will say that the sons of God were humans or Sethites. And there's two arguments to that. The first argument is that these are Sethites and that they were just part of the Sethian line and they produced people that were more warrior-like, but they weren't sort of supernatural. But then that doesn't allow for the size of the giants that are recorded in history. And we can get into some of those dimensions in a few minutes. And it doesn't explain the supernatural nature. And if you get into the definition of giant, it means something significantly bigger than the average type of being that's in that sort of race. There's something that has affected it. And so the other argument is that they're the sons of God as they're called in the New Testament for the Christians that are going to be resurrected. But that is a prophecy that hasn't been fulfilled yet. And that sons of God, as we're adopted, even though we have human fathers versus God as the creator of the angels, as it's recorded in Psalms 104. That is going to be fulfilled after the resurrection. So that's yet to happen when we're adopted. But we're not the same type of creation, and the spirit is different between angels and humans, and that's another concept. But as I stay on topic, we can also look at references in the Old Testament where it's talking about Israel that are called the children of God. And that happens in Isaiah and Hosea. And again, that's a prophecy for the end time with the reconciliation of Israel brought back into the covenant and their resurrection and judgment that's recorded in Ezekiel 37 and elsewhere, like Daniel 12 and other passages, where they're going to be raised up to be like angels as well. So again, that's a prophecy. So as you apply that to the event in the Old Testament, do we get examples of the sons of God in the Old Testament as being angels? And indeed we do. We get in Job 1:6, where you have the sons of God presenting themselves, Job 2:1, where they present themselves and Satan is accompanying there. And some people might say, well, God could have had that throne on the earth as in Eden when they were doing that. Well, that's after Eden, after Satan's fall. And we don't get scripture for God's throne on heaven where the angels present themselves. So you're having to speculate on that. But where it really gets nailed between the difference between the sons of God as being humans or angels in Job 38:4-7. And in there, at creation, and akin to what Psalms 104 is describing, you have the morning stars and the sons of God celebrating at creation. Humans were not there at the point of creation, but angels were. In the council of the gods, you get the sons of the Most High. You have and it's the same term as the sons of God because that's El Elyon, as the God Most High, that are ruling the council of the gods, lowercase ELL, for meaning angel or God. Uppercase L would be the singular form of the God Most High, or El Elyon. And Elohim is the plural, the I am plural there again, but in the superlative uppercase for the God Most High, and also used in a singular event or for the Trinity as well. So you have to be careful on the Hebrew when you're looking at that in Hebrew to understand whether they're talking about Ruach, Jehovah and El Elyon, or it's the singular Elohim there. And typically when Jehovah is just singular, that's when you're just going to see Jehovah, and it's going to be Jehovah of the Elohim, which is a cognate form of the word of God, or the word logos of theos in the Greek. So we have the sons of God of Most High that are ruling the 70 nations over the earth that were split up before the flood. And in Deuteronomy 32, you have the sons of Israel that you get the term for how the nations were split. That's not a mistranslation. It's just misunderstood. So you might have translations that will say angels there and or sons of God there or Israel. They're all accurate. And this is something that I call a dual prophecy that I cover off in book 2, where you get important information from prehistory the time. There's important information for the time of the prophet, in this case Moses, and the taking of the covenant land and the land that God had reserved for himself and gifted to Israel. And then you have a portion of it that's going to be filled in the future, which is after the reconciliation of Israel that I mentioned before, going into the millennium. And that word Israel is a compound word. And it's a word that Jacob has his name changed to that applies to their future promises, and part of it being detailed in Deuteronomy 32. So that's Sarah and El are the two words there. And it means the ruling God, and words similar to that. And so when it says the sons of Israel, it's the sons of the ruling God. So you can apply that to angels and sons of God there, and you can also apply it to Israel as the prophetic fulfillment in part of the dual prophecy. And it's important. There's a lot of dual prophecies in the Old Testament. I won't go through them. I cover that off in book 2, but just to give people sort of cross references as to what's going on, that these are definitely angels that are talking about. And some people might say watchers doesn't show up because they get understood as the term watchers. Well, that's not really true either.
Yeah,
so in Daniel 4 has watchers 4 times.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the Hebrew word Ayir.
Nebuchadnezzar punishment section, if I do believe, right?
Yeah, and these are angels that come from before the presence of God, likely seraphim, as part of the 4 groups of watchers who represent the power of governance and the kingships that are permitted, and the religious aspect as you look at the responsibilities within the hierarchy, and that these watchers are good, loyal watchers. We get seraphim. For people who aren't familiar with that term, that's in Isaiah 6. These are 6-winged, serpent-faced angels as you take them back to Hebrew. And seraphim is the male plural, and they're part of the 4 watcher groups. If people are wondering what the 4 watcher groups are, seraphim, ophanim, cherubim, and archangels. And I know the standard hierarchy doesn't include archangels in the top level. They're in the presence of God.
Yeah,
they have to be watchers. All the watchers there, and they're always on watch. They're always awake. That's the definition of Ayir. And what's interesting, it's also attached to another word, satir. You take that back to Hebrew, which is Sa'ir in Hebrew, which means a hairy watcher, and it's a degraded watcher.
Interesting. Wow,
hairy watcher.
A hairy watcher.
Well, to be specific, a hairy goat watcher.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
Like Pan, Azazel, Bacchus, Ionis, Cern, Cernunnos, fallen angels like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Some of those names that you mentioned, some we're going to be familiar with, but there's a lot there that you just covered. I want to kind of unpack a little bit. So it's interesting to me that I guess before we get into some of that, is what is the root of some of the Sethite interpretation, right? Where these, instead of angels, or watchers in this particular case, having this incursion and mating with human women and producing these wackadoo offspring, and then they produce more wackadoo offspring, which we're going to get into, that I did want to ask you your opinion on, and that's going to get into some other questions. When you read all this stuff and you start to dive into it, and you probably had the exact same experience that we've had, it seems like all of this stuff was well known to our biblical forefathers, right? This wasn't like up in the air. This wasn't a question mark. This was well known. So where do we start to see these other ideas of some kind of humanistic view, like a Sethite view? I've even heard, like you kind of mentioned, these mean, cruel rulers that rule over, and that's what the Bible's actually talking about. Where do some of these crazy other theories come from?
Well, there's a number of sources, and we get a heavy influence starting a couple hundred years ago that has roots to beginning with the formation of the Roman Catholic Church, and that the church fathers are having a debate, and they're struggling at that time to say, could that really be actually true? And what they're trying to do is separate themselves from the polytheists. They don't want to be sort of confused there. And that's part of it. The second part of it is, and I'll put it into like 3 parts, maybe 4. The second part of it is they don't want to have that term sons of God to in any way stain the meaning of the Word of God, who is the Son of God, as he's called in the New Testament. And when I've talked to ministers, they say you just can't have other sons of God. That would mean he's not really the Son of God. I said, well, my response to that is you have to read all of the passages and understand everything in the context. And that if you look at the Word of God, that's when God speaks. So he's there in Genesis 1 as the Word of God. And so is the Ruach there in Genesis 1 too, just as Elohim in the superlative tense there is when he makes the command, the Word creates everything, as Colossians 1 talks about. That includes the angelic order. So it doesn't diminish Jesus at all. And he's called the firstborn of creation. And he's the branch of God as an extension to do these things. And there's a distinction between God and Jesus, but they're inseparable. And I won't go through this whole Trinity argument in too much more detail, but you can also read in Proverbs 8, where he is first created and before creation, and he's there in the beginning, and as Alpha Omega. So they don't want to diminish that sort of aspect, and they don't want people to think that he's like a fallen angel or any way associated with the giants. And so that's part of that sort of protection. The third part of it is that if you look at the 4-class system that was imposed on the whole world, and the feudal system as it would be understood in the European context through the Middle Ages, is the giants imposed this 4-class system everywhere. And in the top 2 classes, you have the royals, and they populate the ruling class, the warrior class, they populate the priest class, and the teaching or the educated class, and the oligarchical class. And then they leave the bottom 2 as a small entrepreneurial class, like in ancient times, like bakers and blacksmiths and things like that. And then you have the slave and working class and or sacrifice class. It's all part of the same class to them. That's the same 4-class system that is all over the world. Whether you go to First Nations in North America with the bloodline chiefs, they have that 4-class system in place. And that they don't want us to recognize that we've been ruled by these royals, meaning kings of God, as you take that back in its etymology, understanding Al is a transliteration of El for an angel or a god, just as it shows up in Baal, meaning master god or Lord God. And one of the ways that the secret societies like to say Lord God, as it is in the Bible, is actually talking about Baal, even though it doesn't go back there in the Hebrew. It's Jehovah of the Elohim, as you take that back. And so they don't want to diminish that whole recognition of Jesus as being God. And again, without getting too deep into it, it doesn't, because it says he created at God's command everything. And so I think that's one of the things that they're protecting. And then the flip side of it is the sending in of polytheist moles into the Christian church to go with an interpretive approach, which is polytheism, and to suppress the knowledge of the giant so that we don't wake up and say, wait a minute, these are not all humans. These are a different species that have been persecuting us all throughout our existence. And they've controlled everything, including our current churches. And even with the beginning of Protestantism, you have this influx of moles into the Protestant churches to suppress that ideology. So now, whether or not it's in the Roman Church or Protestantism, in the seminary schools, they are told not to teach about prehistory and not to teach about prophecy. And so they're teaching about a third of the Bible, good values, but it's completely out of context. And to understand the values and why those principles have been put in place, we have to understand prehistory. And if we want to understand prophecy and the allegories, we have to understand prehistory as well, because nothing is new under the sun, as Ecclesiastes 1 tells us.
Yep.
And what was will be again. And it goes on to say the understanding of this only brings grief and sorrow.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot there that's going on that, again, to unpack. And it's so funny because the thing that just popped in my head when you were talking about that is, like we always say on the show, as it was in the days of Noah.
Yeah.
The more I study, the more I find that not only we know God's layered, right? God is very layered in what he says and what he does, has multiple dimensions to it. Hebrew has multiple dimensions to it. But it's also very much the same with Christ. And by the way, just as a fun side note, before I follow up with my question, we have on the chat over here a little gentleman you might know by the name of Justin Brown. I don't know if you can see or not, but he said, "Tell Gary I said Esau was a Bigfoot."
Well, he was certainly hairy.
He's just trying to sell.
Hairy. That's
right. He's just trying to sell books. Don't listen to Justin.
And he liked to live amongst the caves.
That's right.
Grant that part as well.
Yeah. No, it's so crazy because, as Justin's done and we've done, and obviously you've done, and anybody gets into this, and which is a fantastic thing. The thing you touched upon right out of the gate is so important, is to be the contrarian, right? Don't just have somebody pouring honey in your ear hole and take it as gospel, right? Go read for yourself. And it's amazing when you do what God will reveal to you. But one of my things that I had written down that I wanted to follow up on that you had mentioned was this whole concept of the bulls of Bashan and like Baal that you just mentioned, and bulls in general. Is it your understanding too that when you see these things now in our normal modern day, that it's basically just in your face, a flag waving of all of this stuff?
With the You're referencing to the reference to bulls and things like that.
Yeah, like outside of Wall Street.
Of the bull
horns. Right.
And, yeah. Of course. So everything that was done in the past, as Adam has two sons, and this is where it begins with Cain and Abel, and then later Seth. Cain never forgives God, and he's going to teach his knowledge to Enoch, who's going to create, according to polytheism, the 7 sacred sciences that we know as the 7 liberal arts, and that's going to eventually merge with the knowledge of the fallen angels. But he's going to discipline Enoch, son of Cain, is going to put that into the 7 disciplines, and then create mysticism of the sun and bull cult to protect that knowledge as it's being developed, so it doesn't get into the hands of the Sethites or the mundane, as they'll come to look at the Sethites as. And so they have 4 goals when they did that. So one is to not give God credit for anything. 2 is to defame God. 3 is to lead people away from God. And 4 is to honor the pantheon of gods in everything they do, whether or not it's in names, imagery, icons, naming things after them. They keep it in front of our noses all the time. And so when they're using terms like bulls, they know what they mean by a bull. And that's part of the bull cult. And it's not only made famous through the age of Taurus in astrology, which is polytheism and a corruption of astronomy, as they try and have everybody feel that their fates are in the hands of the starry host, Hebrew word Saba, for an army of angels, in this case fallen angels, that are represented not only in the 7 wandering stars, but angels are also called stars, and it's used interchangeably with the host of heaven and with the sons of God and with angels. And throughout the Old Testament, you have those terms being used together. Another testimony for sons of God being angels, because they're all interchangeable terms that are used together. And so that's part of the imagery. And people will say, well, what angel is a bull? Well, you actually do have a bull in there, and it's one aspect of one of the watchers. It's actually one of the heads of a cherubim, which is depicted as an ox or a bull. And when a cherubim would take a physical form, it would take one face. One of those faces would be a bull. That's where the bull understanding comes from. And it's part of the throne of the polytheist throne of gods that rule the earth and the multiple throne rooms that they have. And there's also three other faces on a cherubim that people will recognize as part of cherubs or cherubim, as they're depicted in a singular face. You have a lion's head, you have a bird's or an eagle head, and you have a human head. So you might see like a sphinx that has a lion or a human head. You'll have a cherub, which is just a different pronunciation of the ch as we do, as in the original ch is in a k in the Mesopotamian pronunciation there, as opposed to an h sound in Hebrew, where it's typically pronounced as a ha, as in horim, chorim. That you're going to have bulls and even gargoyles, and gargoyles are the bird look to the cherubim, and they're all the same being. But when we look at reliefs in the Middle East, you can see two that represent the Anunnaki, and Anunnaki are watchers, and associated with the Igigi, different kinds of watchers, and that the Igigi is like associated with the word eyes and to watch, as in Ig and Iggy in ancient Sumerian, just as Ayer is to watch and be awake for watchers in heaven. And these watchers are represented in iconology and imagery all over the world. Just look at coats of arms. You've got dragons on there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You've got unicorns, which are an allegory for the cherubim. You have lions and you have eagles. These are all, again, part of the cherubim, the most powerful. And the cherubim are kind of like warrior type of angels as well, just as you have two cherubim with swords of fire guarding the gates of Eden after the ostracization of Adam and Eve. And so they are going to populate their imagery with in the whole world on everything that honors the pantheon of the gods, whether it's the buildings, whether or not it's the names they name things after. And so bulls are always kept alive. And if you look in most polytheist ancient cultures, the bull has a significant aspect to that polytheist religion, and it's in all of the religions around the world. And even the sun disk is held between two horns.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, talking about the sun and the moon and the worship of all that stuff, because and this kind of ties into, before I go here, I guess it ties into another question I was going to ask you, and I think it's kind of rhetorical, but I just want to still ask the question, because I don't think you can really get to all the things that you've gotten to without these. But I would assume a lot of the, what we would call extra biblical texts, like the Book of Enoch, and I don't know how much of the Book of Jubilees you've kind of gotten into or not, but I'm sure that that's kind of helped shape a lot of this too, because you kind of have to mold them together in order to get this complete picture that you don't get in just the Bible.
Yeah. So the first thing, if you're going to do things outside the Bible, what I recommend, advise people to do, is measure all things written outside the Bible against what's written in the Bible, and note the differences. And if it's directionally different, you want to understand that that is not something that you want to rely on. And if it's from a polytheist piece of information, understand that's an interpretation that's designed for their agenda. So you want to be careful on that. And for things that are generally associated with the Bible in terms of its history or apocrypha, you still want to use that same sort of measurement. So do I use in book 2 direct references from the Book of Enoch? Absolutely. Or in book 1, I'll use the polytheist references to show you what they believe. Absolutely. But I also know the Book of Enoch has some issues to it. We do not have a complete Hebrew manuscript to it. So I have a document I send out to people when they ask for it that shows some of the differences, to show you that there's some corruptions in there. Not a lot. I like Book of Enoch. Enoch. Jubilees is a little bit different. I think it's good to read it. I think it's good to understand it, but understand that it is a solar-based belief system in the Jubilees, Book of Jubilees. And whether this is the original or not, we need to understand that polytheist groups like the Essenes look at the Book of Jubilees and Enoch, son of Cain, as two of their most revered items, one being a patriarch, one being what they would call their scripture. In the Old Testament, for the Hebrews, for the people of Israel, and one deduces that would be the Sethites before the flood as well, would be done on God's calendar that he asked us to use, which is the lunar calendar. And so the solar calendar is part of the sun worship. And that solar calendar worship is introduced by Enoch, son of Cain, versus Enoch, son of Jared. And for people who aren't aware, there are two Enochs. You need to understand that because the secret societies and the Gnostics like to conflate the two and then adopt them in and use that as wedge issues against Christians. So we have to understand they both wrote scripture. So in the book of Enoch, when it says he's 500 years old, that's a corruption. Enoch, son of Jared, is taken to heaven at 365. So we have to be careful there. Now, I don't think that corrupts the whole first book of Enoch, but it shows that there we don't have the original Hebrew, and there's likely been some changes there. Second Enoch, I do not like. I think that's been totally corrupted or is polytheist, as opposed to third Enoch, which is even more corrupted and has Enoch, son of Cain, as I think they're clearly describing him being raised to angelic status through his knowledge, just like Thoth was or Mercury was and other gods around the polytheism, and even to son of God status, as he's described in their name Metatron. I think that one's totally corrupted. I do like, but we only have fragments of it, is Enoch, Book of Giants, as opposed to its longer version where you get the Manichaean Book of Giants and you get some Persian influence and Manichaean influence on that. But I do like the fragments that we have on the Book of Giants. I think that one may be part of the original as well. So that's my advice. And if you're going to be speaking to Christians, I always measure against the Bible. I start with my Bible premise first, and then I start to try and add in some other context.
No, that's good. That's exactly kind of the same path that I went. When I started reading the Book of Enoch the first time, I was like, kind of, it made so much sense because it filled in a lot of holes that are not necessarily talked about in Genesis. Not to disparage Genesis, but I think what we're getting in Genesis, first of all, I know it's largely attributed or most often attributed to Moses, but I think there's a lot of scholars out there that'll say it was actually probably multiple writers that had their hand in that, and one of them could have actually been Noah. It's very possible. So I think what you're getting is, I think you're getting kind of a rehashing of events, so to speak, a Cliff Notes version, because it was well known to them. But when we read it now, it just doesn't seem that way. So when we read Genesis 6:4, we're like, whoa, you just talked about some kind of event that's like angels and human women, having intercourse and producing offspring. Why did you only spend 2 seconds on that?
So two things for people to look at in terms of the Bible is, number one, is that it's going to come down, depending on your timing of the Exodus, somewhere between 1200 to 1450 BC. And, I'm of the older dating on that from a biblical chronology. And that is a younger handing down of the Torah to Moses by God than what you get polytheist accounts on. And so they'll have references to the same events in polytheism, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and they'll say it's an older version, therefore it was copied. We have to understand when we received the Torah, and it's a later date. It doesn't mean that it's not accurate. It's just that that's what's provided to Moses. There would have been probably things that Noah had that he likely took with him on the ark that would be some of these older books that have been lost. And even after the advent of Israel. So you could be like, you have the Toledoth of Adam or the Toledoth of Noah and all these other ones that are thought to be making up and forming parts of Genesis and parts of the Book of Enoch. And then you have the 70-roll hagiography that we don't have anymore. That was also part of the first temple. So we may not have the larger versions that are there. What we do know about the Book of Enoch is an almost word for word is in the book of Jude, when it talks about Enoch, is pretty much word for word what's recorded in the book of Enoch. And we also have words that we can take back to Hebrew that are still utilized in the book of Enoch. And even though we don't have a complete Hebrew manuscript, we only have Greek and Ge'ez. I recommend the Ge'ez version or the Ethiopian version because it has a few more chapters. But for example, is you have an angel that's in Eden, that's likely Satan, who is the cherubim in Eden, as Ezekiel 28 talks about. And that name is Gadrael. That word means wall of God or God's wall. It has a Hebrew meaning attached to it with two Hebrew words. And Ophanim, which is a term that I used earlier for one of the watcher groups, those are the angels that are in Ezekiel 1, 3, and 10 that are in the wheels in the throne of God vision. And there's two words in Hebrew that are used for wheel there. One is for the actual wheels, which is Gilgal, as in Gilgal Raphaim, or the wheel of the giants. That's at the foot of Mount Hermon. And the angels that are distinct from the cherubim, because one of those faces of the four-faced Ophanim is a cherubim face, so it's distinct, and it's in the wheel versus being in front of the throne, as depicted as pulling the chariot of God in the book of Psalms. That is the Hebrew word ophan for those beings that are within the wheel. And you put the I am male plural on, like cherubim or seraphim, and you get Ophanim. And that's one of the four groups of watchers, and as they're named Ophanim in the book of Enoch. So we have lots of those types of words that we can take back to the Hebrew. So we know it has a Hebrew basis. We don't know what additions have been put into it or what all the corruptions might be.
Yeah, someone, I don't know if you saw it or not. I don't know if you can see the chat on your end. It'd be great if you could. But someone actually, yep. Oh, perfect. Yeah, someone asked, what's the language of Enoch? The answer to that is, I guess, and Gary can correct me if I'm wrong here, all of the copies that we have found thus far in Qumran, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I believe were Aramaic. They were no Hebrew. They were only Aramaic. And then the ones that we have the most complete version of are actually the Tewahedo Jew, which is Eritrean and Ethiopian, which is the Ge'ez that Gary mentioned. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's quite accurate. And also we have Greek versions as well. Yeah, but they're later versions. So those are the oldest ones that we would have the full the full book of Enoch that we have today, with the language is not original Hebrew. And Aramaic is not Hebrew. Aramaic is introduced when Israel is in exile, or southern kingdom Judah is in exile in Babylon, and all of the people lose the language of Hebrew except for the rabbis. And then so Aramaic is like the Greek of the Persian and Babylon Empire, right? That's the international language. And so they create the Targums from Babylon in Aramaic starting then, because they're trying to teach Hebrew to non-speaking Hebrew people, and they're trying to add editorialism into it. So you want to be careful with the Targums as well.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll add, just to answer this person's question, one of the things that I have found too when I started to study, typically a lot of scholars will use when we find these manuscripts, we find these fragments, or really more fragments than anything. What language are they written in? And they'll typically date or try to date the manuscript or the book or whatever it is based on that. Obviously, Aramaic would be more recent than Hebrew.
Yeah.
The only challenge with that is just because that they couldn't find a copy in Hebrew doesn't mean that at some point it wasn't originally written in Hebrew and we just didn't have that anymore. And at some point, maybe that it got damaged and it was retranslated into Aramaic or whatever. So it's kind of a little bit of a dangerous scholarly road to go down.
It is. It's one of those pieces of misinformation that polytheists love to utilize, and we need to be aware of that. And we need to understand that there were scribes all the way down through Israel and what I call visible Judah versus the lost tribes of Israel, and that they continually updated the scrolls to ensure that they wouldn't be lost and that they had lots of copies of them in case of war and things like that. So that was a regular renewal of that. And when you're writing on scrolls, they have a shelf life versus stone, where they would have originally done some of the major ones on, which is why you don't tend to have a lot from the Old Testament of more ancient version on scrolls, because they're only what's surviving of that was done in stone.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating things they actually found in Qumran was something they call the copper scroll, where they actually had inscribed on copper so that it would actually not wither. Yeah, like a parchment would, or just look like a cloth. One of the other things too that I wanted to kind of, and this is an interesting question for the 52-minute mark, but I have to ask just because I probably put the cart before the horse a little bit here. But what was your path, just out for a fun curiosity question, to get into this? And because it kind of seems like in talking to you maybe have more of a traditional route like where we got into the church, we were taught one thing, and then as I started to dig into it and I started to scratch my head a little bit and go, things ain't 2 and 2 ain't making 4 here. So is that kind of what your path was too?
Kind of, but some distinctions. So after I became a teenager and was completely sort of brainwashed through the education and peer pressure, I dropped Christianity and became secular and a fan of evolution. And I came back on my path, which gave me the new eyes to have a look at things, with a challenge. And we were drinking one night when I was 20 or 21 years old, and my brother and a friend were there, and they're talking about Antichrist, a false prophet. And they said, late into the evening, how brave are you? And if you have enough courage, we'd like to challenge you to read a book. And I thought they probably were going to talk about the Bible because of what they were talking about. But it was a book by Hal Lindsey and the late great Planet Earth. And so I read it, and it scared the socks off of me. And so I wanted to verify whether what he was saying was accurate. Was he manipulating what was said, leaving out inconvenient passages, And so I looked up the passages. They looked like he was quoting them accurately, but it didn't tell me about the full context. So the only way I could learn about that was I had to learn the Bible. And I had to start reading it from back to cover. And then I decided, well, this is such a big topic, I'm going to have to log all the prophecy narratives. And I found I was badly equipped to do that and had to reinvent how I was going to do that all of the time. And each time as I'm going through the Bible to log these passages out, you get to Genesis 6 and you get this cognizant dissonance, like giants. What the heck is that? And whatever it is, that's not what I'm here for. The problem, though, is it kept coming up. And even after the flood. And then you've got demons, and you've got fallen angels, and you've got the stuff carrying through to the book of Revelation in a lot of the cases. And I can make a good case, and I do in book 2, that the mighty men are the descendants of the giants that are talked about in terms of the kings and the mighty merchants and things that are being talked about in the book of Revelation as you take that back to Greek. And so I had to learn about the giants, and I didn't want to. But I decided I'm going to log it all out. And I got fascinated with it. And I was a history and a mythology buff before. So I know about heroes. I know about the Watchers. I know about these types of things. And so it's connecting. It's kind of connecting with me, but I'm not really sort of ready to do anything with it. But when I decided I had all of the prophecy sort of laid out, and I understood that there's a direct relationship between prehistory and the allegories with end time prophecy, is I thought, if I want to write about prophecy, maybe I should try and see whether I can get published and can I even write a book, and would anybody buy it, and would anybody like it? And so I thought, I'll write a short book and I'll just connect Genesis 6 with Revelations. And so I wrote the first 10 chapters fairly quickly, but then I realized I needed to put more context in this. So along the way to the Colosseum, so to speak, it went in down past I never thought I would go down.
Yeah, right.
But what the main thing through that whole 6,000 year history is the bloodlines of the giants.
Yes.
I was getting ready to ask that.
Go ahead, fire away.
Yeah, how do they come after the flood? How did it all start up again?
See, this is what he does. He sits over here. He just kind of waits, bides his time, and then he comes in with heavy ones like that. That's like the $1 million question.
So biblically, we're not told how giants show up after the flood. And we need to sort of understand that, but we know they do.
Mm-hmm.
Because we get the term giants, which is typically goes back to singular Raphaim, who I explore in great detail after the flood in book 2, versus Nephilim. Nephilim only shows up 3 times in the Old Testament. Once in Genesis 6:4, and 2 times in the same sentence in Numbers 13:33, in the embellished part of the report of that came back from the scouts, including Caleb and Joshua, just in the time of the Exodus. And it says that the Enoch are the sons of giants, which is Nephilim. And that's not, we have to understand that's an embellished part of the report. Rephaim is used 25 times in the Old Testament. And Rephaim is used to describe the Anakim in Deuteronomy 2, where that word says, and it says it twice to underline it, that the Anakim were giants, Rephaim, as in the male plural, as were the Horim, as were the Emim, as were all the giants seemingly after the flood.
Mm-hmm.
And that the scouts were talking about the Nephilim in an embellished way, as they're describing the Anakim, which had 3 Anakim kings, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, named several times throughout about during the time of the Exodus and even into the days of the judges early on, when they're finally killed, those 3 Anakim kings. And that these giants were used to scare the Israelites, even though the Anakim were giants, and the word Rapha is 7497 for giant, rooted in 7495 heel and 7496, all part of the same extension out of 7495 to heel, as in demon spirits in 7496 Rapha, evil spirits, words like that. They're all related, and the derivative words have carry partial of the meaning. So in the Ugaritic text, for example, where you get the Raphaim being created by Baal and Anat, they are healers. They can heal themselves and they can heal others. And most translations like to refer to that as describing them as healers versus the other options that they could have selected for that. But they're also described as giants, or Gibor or Gibborim, and they're also dynastic kings. So we get all of that meaning in the Ugaritic text, which just fits perfectly with kings like King Og, who is king over Edrei and Ashtaroth, and he's the last of the giants, or the remnant of the giants after the flood. And Rapha there is the Hebrew word for giant. Giant is translated one other time in the book of Job, when it's describing an individual as a giant, and that's the Hebrew word Gibor or Gibborim, which is the term used to describe the giants in Genesis 6:4 with mighty ones or heroes, depending on the translation that you're talking about into English. And so Gibborim shows up 154 times in the Old Testament, not always to describe a giant, but most often to describe a giant. So with that sort of on the table is we have to be careful with the distinction between Rephaim and Nephilim, but how do giants show up after the flood? Because we have these Rephaim giants showing up after the flood. So there's only a few ways that can happen. And there's kind of like 3 different buckets. So one bucket, which is my least favorite one, is somehow on the ark through the wives.
Ham.
And I understand that you could have them as Ham as a giant, but that's a Gnostic belief, by the way, as opposed to a monotheist belief. But the more monotheist one is through the wives. And so I don't think that that's possible, but because we're not told how, you have to leave that open. I think it's unlikely you could have giant genes and the 4 races embedded into the wives. That gets too complicated with such few people to have that sort of work afterwards. And I can make a case for second incursion after the flood, and I do, but I just don't have that smoking gun verse, even though Genesis 6:4, though Genesis 6:4 says that they went to the wives again. We don't know when again is, but you can get awfully close with that in other passages. That's why I leave a small crack open. Another way is that they were helped by fallen angels, either on the ark, with another ark, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in Upnapishtim or Uzziah Zudra, in those accounts is a offspring of the gods and a human, and is 2/3 God and 1/3 human. Definitely a demigod. Deucalion and Pyrrha are the Greek Noah, and whoever Noah's wife's name is, we don't have that biblically. We get other names, but there's different names that are used for his wife, depending on which apocrypha that you're reading.
Yeah, typically Mzara is what I think.
Mzara or Nama is another one that is also used.
That's an interesting
so you want to
one.
be careful. Yeah, you want to be careful with that, and because there's be multiple names with Nama, right? But we don't get the name, and so fallen angels could have helped them on another ark. And Deucalion is the offspring of Prometheus. So he's a giant, just in the Greek side. These are giant accounts. And you get giant accounts of survival all around the world. So that's a possibility. I favor second incursion, and I make a very good case for that in book 2. And how you get there through biblical passages. But it's still, you don't have written in the book of Genesis that Baal and Anat created the Rephaim, right? Or the Baalim did not. Yeah, it would be nice, but we don't. So a lot of people will also say, but that doesn't really stack up survival somehow, some way with what it says in Genesis 6 and 7. Well, you can make a legal argument, which is, again, why I leave a crack open for survival. Not only is it recorded in polytheism, but biblically it says God was going to destroy everything he created from the earth. Not from the sea, but from the earth. And he did not create the giants. And so the fallen angels did. So you could make that legal argument in those 2 passages in Genesis 6 and Genesis 7, that God is Alpha Omega, knew everything that was going to happen before creation, and he's letting everything play out through free choice, just as angels had free will, free choice to rebel, and he knew the type of things that they were going to do, and why the plan to create from the beginning the Adamites to be the resolution to the angelic rebellion is so powerful, and how the fallen angels did not understand that there would be a resurrection. Otherwise, they wouldn't have crucified Jesus, as 1 Corinthians talks about. That it starts to make some sense that fallen angels are wanting their spurious ones to continue to try and ensure humankind doesn't reach our destiny that we have to choose through faith and get immortality, because we were created mortal, whereas angels were created immortal. And so I leave that crack open. I heavily fall into a second incursion one, but even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you get a second incursion, and you have survival with the ark story of giants with Upnapishtim and all of his family, his archetypical Nephilim, all 2/3 God, 1/3 human. And Gilgamesh is 6th generation after the flood, king of Uruk, son of Lugalbanda in Uruk, and the fertility goddess Nin, and a bull goddess.
Oh, here we go again.
Right.
The bull is
common.
back.
Yeah. And Gilgamesh is called a bull as well. right? And just as you have the image of Orion as a giant from before the flood, who is trying to slay the bull in Orion as part of the polytheist allegory, goes with that. This again, this is common. So you have a second incursion with Gilgamesh, and Enkidu is created to offset the evil of Gilgamesh. And then you get two accounts of giants being created in Greek mythology before the flood that did all of the wars, and then you have a second class of giants that are created at a later date. And how that works and how you start to understand this, if you want to understand prehistory, one of my pieces of advice for people is understand the difference between parent gods and offspring gods.
Mhm.
Parent gods created giants before the flood. So in book 1, I document how El created giants. In book 2, I talk about Baal and the creation of giants as an offspring god. In polytheism, the offspring gods slay the parent gods and take over. They usurp power. Problem with that is these are immortal beings, so you can't kill them.
Yeah.
But what did happen to these parent gods is at the time of the flood, all the ones who violated the laws of creation and created the terrible ones, both before and after the flood, and terrible ones is one of those terms of giants in the KJV, like in Ezekiel 32, Isaiah 25, Isaiah 14, and elsewhere, from Hebrew Erit or the Eritim. These are ones that are also in the pit prison where the parent gods go. So in Ezekiel 32, the spirits of these giants are in the pit prison in the sides. And then El, the mighty ones that are also speaking to Pharaoh in that dual prophecy there, another dual prophecy, is the Hebrew word El. So you have angels and you have the mighty ones, or the Gibborim, that the terrible one spirits are in there along with their parents. So after the flood, the offspring gods take over. In this case, Baal is the son of El. Zeus is the offspring of Kronos. Anki and Enlil is the offspring of Anu, and on and on and on around the world, because it's the same story. And they all create giants. And so, but they disappear too. And so they're sent to the pit prison as well. And so in the Ugaritic text, you have these fertility rituals where they're trying to bring Baal and Enlil back to create more Rephaim, RPM in the original language of Semitic, just as NPL would be the original vowelless Semitic. And there's no H in either one of those words. So you can see Nephilim or Nephilim. H is part of the evolution into English and Hebrew of an addition, and the vowels were added. So Rapayu, Rapium and Rapiu is generally the transliteration that we get from RPM, but RPM is the Semitic root for Rephaim, just as NPL is the Semitic root for Nephilim that we get in the original Hebrew. They're trying to bring them back because they have a fertility issue after the flood, and they're going to have to intermarry with humans to create the hybrid giants. Like the Amorites, for example, or the Amalekites. And how do we know some of these are hybrids? In Genesis 36, for example, you have Eliphaz marrying Timnah, the daughter of Horim, a Rephaim, as you take Deuteronomy 2's description back to Hebrew, and they start a new dynasty with a low with the precious few females, and that's where the fertility issue comes from. And that's why new dynasties are started with a purebred matriarchal bloodline versus the dragon patriarchal bloodline. But Eliphaz is the son of Esau, brother of Jacob, and they're going to create the hybrid Amalekites. And Esau also marries Oholibamah, which is another Horim, and creates another bloodline of hybrids. The reason why you don't have patriarchs for the 9 patriarchless tribes of the Canaanites, because you only get Heth, Sidon, and Canaan of the 12, and then you get all these names like Jebusites and Archites. That's because those names are Rephaim patriarchs. And Rephaim don't have patriarchs in the table of nations for the 70 nations after the flood, right? And so you can look at those names and you can take them back to a Rephaim patriarch, and I do in book 2 through patrial and Hebrew etymology and patronymic passing on and eponymous passing on of names, and I detail that in detail in book 2. And one can also presume that I deduce, and I make a good case for it, I think, is that Nimrod, who became Gibberim, not a giant, but that's the Hebrew word chalal, meaning he broke his vow, sexual rituals, all sorts of things, and things I don't have time probably to get into today unless you really want to get a lot into Nimrod. He has got a human father, Cush, and doesn't really qualify as a giant, but he is giant-like, and then he intermarries into the original people of the east of Persia, which are the Indo-Aryans, which are giants, and the Elamites, which is Olam, of the ancient people of the east, who the Shemites take the same name on of. And there's 2 distinct groups of Elamites that's recorded in ancient history, and one are the giants, which is the Olam, and the other ones are the Shemites that are going to intermarry with them. Giants are aboriginals in the land after the flood. Their definitions all include aboriginals. They were already there after Babel, after the offspring gods were put into the pit prison and other angels were raised up to rule over that council of gods, because Saba means a host of heaven or an army of angels, which means rank and order, and they would just move up in that ranking to replace the gods after the flood as well that went to the pit prison. And so when we look at trying to understand prehistory, we can get chronology a little bit clearer if we understand the parent gods ruled before the flood, the offspring gods ruled after the flood but are removed, and it's not that we don't have a council of gods still working in those councils over the 70 nations. They're just not named after that.
Yeah. Wow.
Interesting.
I have never heard the Ham was a giant. I'd never heard that one before, but I have heard the tracking of maybe Ham's wife when you look at the genealogical breakdown of all the post-flood Nephilim or post-flood, giants that would run into, which is interesting.
Yeah. Well, Ham is cursed for what he does.
Yes. Well,
And
Canaan.
you can make a case that he either raped his Noah's wife or raped Noah. The language doesn't suggest it's the wife, but that's how people would like to
I think
interpret
that's out
it
there myself, but
yeah. So, but the language indicates that it happened to Noah. And again, I cover this in book 1. I also have a great document and I supply at no charge for people. And whichever way it is, it doesn't really matter. But homosexuality is part of the giant mythos as well.
Yeah.
But it's not Ham who receives the curse.
Yeah,
it's Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
None of the other sons do. And what Canaan does, he says, I'm not going to be bonded. I'm not going to be a slave. I'm going to move to the covenant land amongst the Rephaim, supply daughters to create the giants. And so this has an inference there that if giants were created after the flood, then he supplies wives shortly after. And that Mount Ararat, that actually is Hebrew for curse. So this is the curse for the time where the curse happens. And that even before they are dispersed at Babel, Canaan is supplying wives to the fallen angels to create giants to be the aboriginals in the land that the people of Babel are going to move amongst. And then that Heth and Sidon will continue in that understanding because Hittites become intermixed with the Indo-Aryans or the giants and become thought of as not a Canaanite tribe by a lot of seculars, but as Indo-Aryan tribes. But that's just the intermarriage that is going on there. And so they're going to create something that in the Egyptian execration texts and other texts describe as the Shazu, which were living amongst giant tribes like the Anakim, but they weren't as tall. So they were averaging 6 to 9 feet tall as the measurements come out versus, let's say, 9 to 20 feet tall for
Right.
post-Diluvian giants. And post-Diluvian giants would be smaller than antediluvian giants.
Mhm.
So when people look at Amos 2:4, they say, well, they had to be bigger than 7, 8, 9 feet. Well, that's a simile there where it says they're like the cedars of Lebanon, and as strong as the oaks. That is a simile there, or a type of metaphor in the language. So it can't be exact, because these cedars of Lebanon, they grew to 50 feet tall, or 50 feet wide and 100 feet tall. Again, the perfect 2-to-1 height to width ratio for most of the giants, just as they're called stout in the Old Testament. That's not meaning fat. That means just as the bed of Og was a 2-to-1 ratio of 9 cubits to 4, and he was the king of Uruk, or king of Edrei and Ashtaroth, and just as Josephus says, you measure them on a royal cubit as royales, which is 21 inches versus a standard 18. He would have been closer to 15 feet tall, with the bed being about 16 feet tall, but somewhere between 12 and 15, and 4 to 6 feet wide to fit in the bed. Now, Gilgamesh is a little bit bigger. He's a dark-haired giant, and there's a different watcher involved here. And that he is described not only in the Ugaritic text, but all the various ones through in Sumeria with the same dimension of 11 cubits tall and 4 cubits wide. He'd be 19 feet tall as the king of Uruk and 7 feet wide. Goliath on that cubit, and particularly as the king of Gath, who Ashish replaced afterwards, he would be 11 feet 1 to 3 inches tall on a royal cubit, and he's described as stout as well. But we don't get his exact sort of width, just his height. And even on a common cubit, he'd still be 9 feet 9 inches tall. But all the royales are the descendants of giants.
Yeah, Ben, you had a question.
Yeah. It wasn't a question, it was more of a comment. I always think that the scariest verse in the Bible is, then God remembered Noah. I always think that is like the scariest verse, because where was God? I bring that up like all the time, and it's like,
well, it's interesting, and it is scary that he may have started all over again. Just as God favored and remembered Moses, he threatened to start all over with Israel.
Yeah.
And not for, if it wasn't for Noah pretty much walking with God and being holy and pure, not only of physical nature, but of a spiritual nature, like Enoch, he might have started all over again. And if Moses wasn't so loyal and with the spirit in him, even though he wasn't perfect, he would have started over and threatened to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
there had to be a time too, kind of in that Abraham time. That's one of the things that I've been kind of studying more and more. And it's an interesting thing when you start to study like Genesis, and then you go and you actually look at Jubilees, because Jubilees gives you a much more complete version of like maybe what was going on at the time that you don't necessarily get in Genesis, just like we get in Genesis 6. It's very much that way in some of the other stories as well. And it really gets into a lot of what we talked about today with the worship of the sun and the moon and the stars and all of this celestial worship, right? And really what you get that you don't necessarily get in the Bible is that Abraham made the conscious decision to move away from the polytheistic worship and go back to the monotheistic worship of God. And so that's why God's like, hey, I can do something with this guy. He's pretty awesome.
And he may have been the last monotheist.
Yeah.
So shortly after the flood.
You kind of have to think like, the way we're going here, this is not looking good for part 2.
Yeah.
And I don't know if God's going to go for a part 3.
And that would continue that, Israel would be the small island amongst the sea of Gentile populations and polytheism. Yeah. And so that's sort of the way it has been throughout our history. Yeah. And it's very scary. But I think, God understood as Alpha Omega, and he's looking for people to step up, but everybody still has to choose.
That's right.
That's not fate. Yeah. And so if Isaac if Abraham perhaps wasn't prepared to go right down to the point of sacrificing Isaac to show his loyalty,
Yep.
maybe, and he did sacrifice him, Abraham probably gets killed by God and he starts all over again.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's a fascinating rabbit hole to go down for sure.
Yeah.
I just want to say, you had mentioned something earlier about Gary's original intention was to start off and write a short book on all this, and I just want to state that the Genesis Conspiracy Part 1 is 816 pages. That's what happens when somebody starts off and wants to go from Genesis to Revelation and try to make it a short story. It's hard to do because you find so many rabbit holes to go down. But I want to shift gears a little bit for our last little bit of time here, and we're probably going to have you back. This is my secret ploy to get you to come back, because we've spent a ton of time on the topic and title of the book, but we really haven't done a much discussion on really the subtitle of the book, which kind of takes us on a hard 90 in a different direction, which is how secret societies and the descendants of the giants, because we've covered the giants very well, I think, at this point, plan to enslave humankind. So I want to kind of spend the last little bit of time kind of going down that road, and then I guess we're just going to have to have you come back and talk about probably more of it. So go ahead and make that right-hand turn for us and talk about how we go from what we've talked about into some of that.
So as I was adding in book 1, polytheist accounts around the world, because I'm a mythology and history buff as well, I kind of thought that Christians might need some context. So then I had to learn all about these other religions. I had to read all of the Vedas. I had to read the Gnostic scriptures. I had to read the Popol Vuh. You name it, I read it. So I was giving context to the polytheist cultures around the world. And it's the same pantheon, by the way. It's just different vernacular names to the same pantheon. And it's this root religion that goes back into to Genesis. And as I was researching that, I understood the creation of the 7 sciences and the creation of the sun-worshipping bull cult by Enoch, son of Cain, is in this sort of intermixture of this religion. And that when they decided to develop this knowledge, they needed to develop schools that became known as the mystery schools, where they taught the first 2 classes I talked about earlier in the show, the extended family of the royals, of the sons of God, the sons of heaven, as they're called around the world. And that they were going to only educate the royals. And out of the mystery schools, as they were developing disciplines to develop some of this, they developed organizations, and they became not only initiatory with the religion, but initiatory within the schools and initiatory within these sub-organizations that become secret societies. So just as we see secret societies and initiatory organizations on university campuses today, everything from simple ones that say like an Alpha House or whatever, or to the Skull of Bones of the Ivy League, which is the upper level of these initiatory organizations. That's the beginning of secret societies. And I learned that when I understood that the secret societies take their beginnings back to the patriarchs of the Old Testament, but of the Cain line, of Cain being a patriarch, Enoch being a patriarch, and that Lamech of the Cain line, and Nama, and Jubal and Jubal, and Tubal-Cain, and that these are their greatest patriarchs before the flood. And they created these secret societies of the royals, and the ancient Masons were all royals. What we see today of, let's say, organizations like Freemasonry or the Illuminati or the Rosicrucians, for example, are lower levels of the Masonic bloodlines, lower trunk organizations, as I like to call them, as part of the thelemic tree of organizations that's shaped like a evergreen tree from Mount Hermon. Their words, their terminologies, their hierarchy structure, not mine. And so once I understood that secret societies began in the time of the creation of giants, then I understood why you have to be invited to these secret societies, because you have to be of the bloodline. And so the higher up you go in the secret societies, the more pure your bloodline is. But they have the same account of prehistory, but just seen from a polytheist lens. They have a same understanding of end time prophecy, just a different outcome. And so we need to understand the polytheist lens in terms of how the world works, what they did, what they're doing today, and why they want to bring about a rendezvous with destiny. That's the end time. And they want to do it before the ordained time. But their secret societies were well functioning before the flood, according to their history and the Polychronicon. And that's their oral history that was later written down. We don't see the full published version of the full-size text. We also see it with Albert Mackey and Adaptive Freemasonry writing down the history in a book that he wrote in the 1800s about the history of Freemasonry and all the different versions that they have on the different aspects. And as we start to understand this connection, we need to know that this is part of the whole organizational structure that was before the flood. So you have the giants who usurp all of the kingships around the world. They impose this Enochian mysticism all over the world. Then they establish the mystery schools and the secret societies all over the world. And this is the organizational structure that paraded humankind into destruction in terms of what we see ending up in the flood, but left to its own guys would have probably destroyed the world by fire, except that, as I said earlier, is reserved for the end time. This belief system crosses the flood. And what they do in their history, according to the secret societies, is they write the directions to where all their knowledge is written down in 36,525 books that Enoch, creator of the sun worship, creator of astrology, creator of all the things that we use for the calendars with the sun worship, versus Enoch, son of Jared, which would have been on the lunar calendar. All of this knowledge is written in 36,525 books, yes, a solar number, stacked in 9 vaults stacked on top of each other underneath the Great Pyramid that the secret society say were used from the knowledge that Enoch developed. And they write the directions to this bank of knowledge on 2 pillars. One will survive a destruction by fire, and one will survive a destruction by a flood. And in polytheism, you have ages where you have alternating kind of destructions of fire and water, just as we're moving into the age of Aquarius and the water bearer that has the destruction by fire, which is why they're feverishly working to bring about the end time. And so obviously it's the one that's going to float that a fellow by the name of Hermes, or Harmines, as he's called in the Polychronicon in the history of Freemasonry, finds the pillar, finds the knowledge, takes it to a fellow by the name of Nimrod, who develops this knowledge, teaches 1,000 Masons, uses that knowledge to build Babel city and tower. And we're told in the Babel account in Genesis 11 that as one people acting with one language, nothing that they decide to do will be prevented from them doing. This is a reflection of that knowledge. And that Nimrod initiates 1,000 Masons and writes the first constitution after the flood for the Royal Masons. And he's recognized as the first Grand Master. Nimrod is recognized as the first Grand Master writing the first constitution after the flood for ancient Royal Masonry. We need to understand the interrelationship of the giants and secret societies with us to understand the secret societies of today and what they were trying to do before the flood. It's best encapsulated in a couple of accounts in prehistory. So you have, in the Atlantean tradition, you have Poseidon, who produces through Cleito, a human female, 10 demigod kings that rule over Atlantis. That's the one destroyed by the flood. And they're trying to spread the Atlantean religion, which is the same religion as Enochian mysticism, all around the world, and they're trying to do it by war. They have a antediluvian Antichrist type figure, likely in the allegory of Orion as you get it coming down through Greek mythology, that is trying to bring about a golden age of one universal religion that's not from God and ruled by the demigods who worship the pantheon. That's prevented from happening. Nimrod has the same power, introduces the same religion after the flood. This is what happens in the end time. And understand that the word Babylon for the religion, and it's more than just a religion, but Babylon in the New Testament, in Book of Revelation, or I'll just leave it there because the other one's going to open up another door. We don't have time to go down. Babylon goes back in its etymology that's used there to Babel as being the source word out of Hebrew, and Babel of Nimrod, who imposed mysticism on all of the Noahites as an antichrist wannabe figure 101 years after the flood.
Well, let me try to unpack all that. It's so crazy because it's like, you know, you have to feel like this too, and you've done years and years and years of study to obviously to file a lot of this away, but there is so much to unpack because we're looking back through literally 6,000 plus years of human history now to try to unravel this, and especially like you and me. Ben's different. He was lucky. He was raised in a stronger faith in church because his father's our pastor, and his father's always done a good job of really getting into a lot of these things. So I'm always envious of him and his upbringing. But for you and I that have come through the more modern church system, you've got all of this debris field that you have to try to like sift through to try to find the wormhole to go down to get this stuff from the past to make it make sense. But
and you have to understand their arguments within the church against you so that you can take those arguments on.
Yeah. Because you know, a lot of these people are well versed, right? And some of these, if you're depending on who you're arguing with, right? Yeah. If you're arguing with someone who is embedded in one of these secret sects, right? Secret societies, you know, and they're versed in a lot of things. They're not dumb. So you need to be able to be well armed in order to combat against that. Yeah. And try and recognize some of the tactics that the arguments are used. If it's somebody who's just said, I believe what I've been taught in the church and I'm making all of these arguments, they're going to eventually recognize somewhere along, maybe not all, but most, they may just say, I may agree to disagree. That's fine. That's Christian. But if they are of a polytheist nature or one of the Gnostic moles, they're going to use the chase the rabbit argument. Yeah. And people will recognize this. This is my term, and I think it's the right one, because they never rebut your argument of their first, well, what about this? Right. Yeah. And they just move on and say, well, what about that? And they try and take you down another rabbit hole. Yeah. Right. And when you rebut that, then they would say, well, what about this? But they never recognize or defend their original position. Yeah. Recognize that's the tactic of the polytheists. They're just trying to get you into a point where they finally raise one that you don't have an understanding of. Then they'll say, well, I'll use that, even though I couldn't rebut anything that you said before. Don't fall for that. What I try and do is I'll say, okay, you're playing Chase the Rabbit. I'll play 3 or 4 times or whatever you want to play with them for, and go around there. Once you get there and say, I told you I would play 3 or 4 times, and I told you that if you couldn't rebut any of my arguments, this would come to an end. So this is my last comment. Don't let them keep going forever, because they've been trained. They have these lists of things that they have that they're looking in front of them, knowing that most Christians who have not read the Bible enough to know the difference. So different tactic than somebody who is actually Christian, who may just agree to disagree because they're maybe not ready to have that information, but they're listening at least. Yeah. It's like a greyhound at the track. You're just chasing the bunny.
Yeah. I was like, they'll say never argue with an idiot because they'll drag you to your level and beat you with experience.
Only every time. They're professionals. Don't fight with the professionals. So I guess, to kind of wrap things up for the day, last question, and again, love to have you back to talk about this more. do you see that the tentacles of these secret societies are the ones that are really in control nowadays and pulling the puppet strings on everything that we basically have?
Oh, absolutely they do. So let's use as an example the World Economic Forum and the Davos crew. They answer into the Committee of 300 up the Thelemic tree. That's
Yeah.
committee of 300 families,
Mm.
right? We need to understand that. And it's above the Rosicrucians. It's above the Illuminati. It's above Freemasonry as I go down the Thelemic tree trunk. And they have all of these branch organizations that intersect into these trunk organizations. And so IMF, World Bank, anything to do with trade, World
World Health
WTO,
Organization, yeah.
World Health Organization likely goes in there. It could
Yeah.
fit into a
Yeah.
couple other ones, but and if we understand that they control everything because they have control of all the money, we can't even imagine how much money they have that's off the books, that's stored away in Switzerland that they established for banking.
Or the Vatican.
The Vatican banking is in Switzerland too.
Yeah.
They
Yeah,
got
we had a
control
show.
of that. They got control of by that through the Montesa order, which had order formed to hold the Templar assets in Spain by the King of Spain, that in the 1500s is run by a Grand Master of the Montesa order named Francis Borgia, who sponsors Ignatius of Loyola. Borgia is one of the Black nobility pope lines, by the way. He has grandparents that are popes. And he bails Ignatius out of jail. He uses his Vatican influence to get them sponsored into an order, becomes a Jesuit, becomes the third Grand Master in 1565, partners with the King of Spain, who he was part of the court of before, and they start doing wars with the Vatican to bankrupt them. Vatican surrenders. They get control over the banking through the Jesuits. That's part of that settlement. And then Francis moves the banking to Switzerland. And the Rothschilds are also located there. So they've centralized that. But it's really important to understand that that is a order that is a derivative of the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar was the central organization for all the modern lower trunk orders that we have to this day, so that they wouldn't have all of that centralized and to be taken down in one complete swoop. And all of the original Knights Templar founders were royals, even the two Cistercian monks, because why? They populate all of the priest class as possible. And at that time, all of them were of the elite that were, so they had two Cistercian monks that were in there, and Cistercian monks were Gnostic monks molded into the church anyways. And they were blood relatives of other members of the founding Knights Templar. And that's just the modern wedge of the Royal Mason organization. So when they talk about Masons, unless they're talking just using terms that they don't know what they're talking about, Mason is the term for the ancient Masons, the Royal Masons. Freemasonry is founded after the fall of the Templars and populates the lowest level, or the first level of adept, which is third degree on the York Rite. And divided 11 times is the newer version of the Scottish Rite, which is a 33-degree adept. Illuminati is above that. Then you have the Rosicrucians in the trunk order. Then you have the Committee of 300. Then you have the Council of 33 families, where the invisible ones come, and they're the ones who are trying to restructure the Templars after the fall. Actually get close in 1317, but there's a falling out where they poison the Pope, and they're going to have to go with a decentralized location until they get the new Templars, the Jesuits, back in the church. And then above the Council of 33 families are the 13 families. That's the Western bloodlines. And there are other bloodlines around the world.
Jeez. It's head swimming. How vast. I think we kind of know it, we sense it, we feel it.
Yeah.
We may even know some of it, but it's literally just so vast and so head swimming. And the other thing too is, obviously it's our mission to fight the good fight while we're here and while we're, still on the earth and all these things. But it's easy to see, how clearly as we get closer to the end times, which is the last question that I want to ask you today, just to get your take. We typically do this with everybody here that we have on the show. And if you feel comfortable answering, by all means, and if not, that's fine too. But, you can just feel that this is becoming more and more overt too. It used to kind of like hide behind the scenes, but now it's becoming more and more in your face and more overt. They hide less and less. I mean, my goodness, they meet every year in Davos, Switzerland, right? Like right in front of our face. They come out and they say by 2030, you will own nothing and you'll be happy about it. They don't hide any of this. So when you look at all this in totality and then you compare it to scripture and what Christ said in Revelation and everything, how much longer do you think we have before the curtain gets drawn here?
Yeah, so there's a generation that we're told about by Jesus, and it's called the fig tree generation. And it's an overarching sign to his oration that he provides for the exact chronological order of the main events in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and Luke 21. And we know it's chronological order because he says, and then this happens, and then this happens. That's the Greek word toda. It means exactly that. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. That he's given you the chronological order separated in the middle by the abomination, and then advises you to go look up Daniel so you understand the timing and the meaning of that event. And so when we look at the fig tree generation, this is an overarching sign of one of three provided in his oration to help you guide yourself in it. The other two are the birth pangs or the sorrows, which get stronger and with the same catastrophes throughout that fig tree generation. Even so much so that even the catastrophes that we will think will be apocalyptic because we don't know the Bible well enough won't even be enough for the seal judgments, which is 25% destruction of everything on the earth, including people.
Yeah.
So we could get a war that could kill 10% of the population, and we would think that would be apocalyptic. And it would seem like that to us. And so you have wars, rumors of wars, pestilence. You also have famine and earthquakes, and they're going to get stronger, and they're all contrived. Brought on by those who rule this world, the council of the gods, the invisible ones, by their spurious offspring through the divine right to rule, the royals that rule today, that want to have this rendezvous with destiny.
Yeah.
Right? So they're going to bring this on, and they want to do it before the ordained time, so they have to do contrived things. So when we get the false prophets, they can prophesize catastrophes because they're going to cause them. And they're using that angelic technology to do it that we're just catching up to that was just before the flood. Because we can't do things that they could do before the flood, like change DNA. That's part of the Shakath, ruin, destroy. They ruin the DNA of all the animals and most of the humans and the plant genomes. That's part of the whole understanding of the days of Noah, which is the second and third, or now on the third overarching. And in book 2, I actually do the days of Noah as a full chapter to show you how that can mean a generation or the years of, and how it's used in end time prophecy to talk about a specific generation and the events that happened in those generations, which is more than just the violence that people just like to say it's violence and godlessness. Yes, it's that. Yes, it's the violence. And by the way, the violence was caused by the fallen angels, and as they passed on that knowledge to the giants, Azazel in the Book of Enoch, not from scripture, but additional context that provides a little bit of explanation here, taught all the arts and crafts of war to their offspring.
Yeah.
And that included the technology to build things like the pyramids, Machu Picchu, things that we can't do today, just to keep it sort of short. And that the days of Noah, we need to understand, and those are the exact words that were used in Genesis 9:29 to describe what? The generation of Noah, which was 600 years before the flood and 350 years after the flood. So we have to understand both sides and also understand giants were on both sides of the flood.
Yeah.
and that he uses Sodom and Gomorrah in the Lot version, as well as the days of Noah, as that transition from a destruction by water to the destruction of fire. That is the damage that's going to be caused by the angelic technology, where no flesh would be saved except that Jesus steps in. So there's a specific generation, a fig tree generation. I don't think it's 650 years of Noah, because we don't have those generations. It was reduced to 120 years in Genesis 6:3. And we know it's 120 years because the math doesn't work between the time Noah starts his commission, goes on the ark, is only 100 years, and the Hebrew doesn't say that was the meaning of the time that the Spirit would dwell in human. I mean, take that back to Hebrew. You understand this is a elimination of the body living forever, right? Our human spirits go to sleep and back to heaven, according to Ecclesiastics, and the demonic spirits, which are counterfeit spirits, don't go to sleep, but they're not permitted into heaven. They're either going to the pit prison, wandering the earth, or somehow they get into Sheol and Hades, which is their belief system, that if you have enough knowledge, you can get there. But with the days of Noah as a generation, I would look at three numbers: 40 as the wilderness number, of a generation in the wilderness, 70 as the book of Psalms talks about, or 120 years in Genesis 6. And then you have to know what the fig tree generation is. And Judah, without getting into too much detail, is understood as the fig tree, an Old Testament allegory of God's garden, and is said to be figs in the fig tree. Just as the vine is the allegory for the northern kingdom of Israel that will awaken in the last 7 years. And so when Jesus is on his way to the temple, he is going to kill a fig tree after eating a fruit, because he says it's no longer bearing good fruit. So he uses that as an analogy, and the people of Judah, the southern kingdom at the time, they know who he's talking about. And then he goes in and talks about he's going to have the temple is going to be destroyed, right? And then from there he goes on and gives after the disciples ask for it, he gives the oration of the end time. So the fig tree generation, when you see it in bloom or in leaves, then you know that that's the generation. So there's one specific godless generation, as the book of Timothy talks about. Kind of is pretty accurate. You could fit that over on our generation quite easily.
Yeah.
So
for sure.
When do you use that as the start of the fig tree generation? And because we have the southern kingdom back in the land of the covenant. So they swore their independence in 1947, but one of the other criteria is that the southern kingdom needs to be in control of Jerusalem. They get that in 1967. So I think we might be in that fig tree generation. And if I was to pick one, that's what I would use for information to say that would start that generation. If it's 40 years, well, we're into the Messianic time, as a lot of the Messianic Jews believe we are, and at the end of the 10 Jubilees, which was 2017, and into the Messianic period. But it could be 70 years, which would mean the start of the last 7 years could start sometime after or into the 2030s. But if it's 120 years, we have a ways to go. But even if it's 100, and even if it is 120 years, you don't have to complete that whole generation, because Jesus steps in before everything is destroyed. So I think we're in that fig tree generation, but we have a long ways to go yet. We don't have world government. We have them talking about it. We don't have the universal religion, which has to come first, and the false prophets, and be the thing that actually is going to make the ability to have the 10 kings come. And by the way, nothing new is under the sun. Atlantis had 10 kings. Just as you have 10 toes in Daniel 2, you have the 10
Yeah.
horns
Yeah.
in Daniel 7, the 10 kings and horns in Revelation 12, 13, and 17.
Wow.
And just as you have the Club of Rome, which answers into the Committee of 300, and some say into the Council of 33 through the senior level of the order, have the world divided up into 10 groups or empires, just as the United Nations has done that. They're trying to create Francis Bacon's A Rosicrucian, New Atlantis, and that allegory of the New Atlantis or the New Age is the revisiting or the regeneration of that New Age, or Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, his 1,000-year reign.
Yeah.
It's a counterfeit 1,000-year reign in polytheism that they want to bring about before the advent of Jesus coming. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to deceive us.
Sure.
And so expect a counterfeit Armageddon as well, that Antichrist takes credit for, to kind of fulfill part of that pedigree. So we have that to be fulfilled. You have this major stumbling block of sacrifices being done on a wing or an extremity or overspreading of the temple, as it's described in Daniel 9. That Antichrist enshrines as part of those last 7 years in the end time, Daniel 9:26, where it talks about the time of the end. That's the Hebrew word katz, that means the last days, the end time. So that last 7 years has been reserved when all vision and prophecy is going to be fulfilled, and we get the introduction of righteousness, or the reign of Jesus for the true millennium. And in the middle of that is when the abomination happens. And so we have that last 7 years that has a set time, but we don't know exactly when that's going to kick off. But I think that coincides with about the timing of the opening of the seals as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things, and we don't have time to go into it today, but understand that the book of Revelation is the testimony of Jesus, just as he's the spirit of prophecy and the word of God of prophecy, that was given to an angel to provide a vision to John that he went to see in spirit. Revelation has to fit perfectly with Jesus's oration in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and 21. It has to. He would not contradict himself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's his testimony that he's provided. And it does, if you understand how to break up revelations. And I would encourage people to look at the churches as the first piece. And there's also some prophecies that are put in with the blessings to the churches that aren't fulfilled to the end time. It's kind of like one of the dual prophecies of the Old Testament, part of a vision prophecy as well as in some of the Daniel prophecies. It's got the same MOs of that. Some of the things that haven't been fulfilled, so just that people don't know that I'm talking through my hat, is that you have 10 days of tribulation.
Mm.
That wasn't fulfilled in
Mm.
that period of time. That's 10 years of tribulation.
Yeah.
And that happens before, obviously, and inclusive of the tribulation of the saints that's recorded in Revelation 7, which is distinct from the Great Tribulation that's talked about in Matthew 26, for example, where it says tribulation, and then he's talking about also tribulation in Matthew 24, 7-8, where it says affliction. Those words both go back to thlipsis. Same word, different translation. And people will say, well, they were using it for this because it's different than the Great Tribulation. And it's, well, okay, that's fine. But, you know, in the book of Mark, when it talks about the Great Tribulation, and it's the exact same wording for the most part, except that it's translated as affliction.
Yeah.
It goes back to thlipsis. So there's a Great Tribulation not seen since the beginning that also 2 Peter 3 is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the tribulation of the saints that Jesus is talking about, with it's translated as affliction in Matthew 24 before the abomination. And the same tribulation that's happening for the tribulation of the saints that the first part of this resurrection sequence where you have the first fruits who are martyred are told to wait for 3.5 years until the complete first half is done. So anyways, I was going on in how you quickly sort of understand Revelation. Sorry, I got down that rabbit hole. So Revelation 6 to 14 is about the first 3.5 years.
Yeah.
Okay. And in Revelation 14, starting in about verse 7, you're going to get the angel preaching the final gospel, which Jesus is talking about in before the abomination in Matthew 24 that happens. It also includes the two witnesses that in Revelation take 3.5 years to finish just before the destruction of Babylon. And you also have the 144,000 that are shown in 14:1 through about 7, which are shown as first fruits in heaven as the completion of the first fruits resurrection. And it's Christ the first fruits, and then when he comes, those who sleep and those who are still alive as part of that resurrection sequence. And then after the angel preaches that gospel, as Matthew says, as it said in Matthew by Jesus, then the end will come. That's the great tribulation. That's after the abomination. Then you get a summary in Revelation 14 of the major events of the last 3.5 years, beginning with the destruction of Babylon, which happens first, as recorded in detail in Revelation 17, by the 10 kings who hand their power over to Antichrist, who rules for 3.5 years in Revelation 13. And then you get the introduction of the mark of the Antichrist. That's recorded in the detail in Revelation 13. And then you have the harvest, which is the Armageddon War that happens in Revelation 19. And so you get that lineage, and that's the same lineage that and chronologies that is shown in Matthew 24, Luke 17, and 21. Yeah. So don't let people just fool you. You can line things up. And when you put everything around what Jesus said versus vice versa, or vice versa, as some people say, you take away all the contradictions. Yeah, everything fits, even the Old Testament. Yeah. And if you want to understand it, you just have to believe what a Redeemer said. And he wouldn't make it so you couldn't understand it. He gave it to us so we would understand. And what we do is we complicate it and try and use it to deceive people. Those two things derive at a whole bunch of different things. And it's okay to agree to disagree on prophecy. But one of the things I try and do is that I believe there can be no contradictions. Yeah. And you cannot leave out inconvenient passages. Yeah. And do not try and reinvent what the Bible says. Yeah.
I see that quite often myself. So it's one of those things like we talked about in the very beginning of the show, and it's a great place for us to put the stop on today, which is, get in there and read for yourself. Go study God's word, go study Christ's words in Matthew 24 when he's, clearly talking about the end times. Go in there and read for yourself. And then, everybody sees it every day when we turn on the TV. We see what's going on around us. There's no doubt about it. I know there's tilts and spins to a lot of the media, but we can still see the reality of what's going on around us. So, but Gary, thanks so much, man. Really appreciate you coming on the show. No and we'd love to have you back to dive into more, man.
Yeah.
Yep. Can I finish off with just one thing for people to think about?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw out some names here. These are giant names recorded in the Bible. And just to give people an idea, and these aren't the hybrid giants. So you have like the Emim, you have the Anakim, and notice I'm using the I am plural, and I explain that in book 2 why you don't use ites, because ites, as in Israelites, aren't giants. Some of the ites are hybrids, but I am is the plural that was used in ancientology and in some of the names in the Bible. But you have the Emim, the Anakim, the Horim, and the Avim that are talked about in Deuteronomy 2. You also have the Hivim, you have the Hurim, and you have the Horim, you have the Perizim, you have the Amalekim, you have the Zuzim, you have the Zamzuzim, you have the Gesherim, the Gerzim, the Makathim, the Kenazim, the Kenim, the Kadmonim, the Cherithim, the Caphtorim, and the Caljulim, and the Jebalim, just to name it. I haven't named them all giant nations that are recorded after the flood in the Bible. And in book 2, I show you how you know they're giants, and I take them back to their patriarch, and some of them to their eponymously named celestial mafia godfather.
Well, for those of you out there who want some information on how to get Gary's works, and I would highly recommend you pick these books up for a lot of detailed information we talked about today. You have the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and then you have the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2. Thank you, Vanna. That's very appreciative of you. And then if you want to get these books, you can actually get them through our website. Gary's page is actually already up. I already made sure his page was up and ready to go. And when this episode comes out, you can actually get it there. So if you go to thetfhc.com/guests and you click on Gary's page, you will be able to actually get his works there through our Amazon affiliate links, which actually helps him out and the show. So by all means, go there.
Yeah, and if you want the digital version, on my website, there's a link to Amazon for the Kindle version of both. And shortly, I'll have a link up for the Audible version for book 1. We finally got an Audible version done after many attempts and failures and cost overruns and things like that. So it's available through Amazon Audible now, and also through iTunes. And it's narrated by Nell Jackson. It just came out about a month ago. And they're working on book 2. That's going to be a little bit longer. Mel Jackson, unfortunately, is recovering from redlining 3 times with heart attacks and an out-of-body experience. And so we're praying for him to come to health. And I needed somebody who could understand the Apocrypha, ancient words. And as difficult as book 1 was to do, book 2 is even more difficult. So,
as you just read,
yes. Hoping that'll be out before Christmas. But people have been asking me for years for book 1, and so many people have tried, but they start into it and they just say we can't. It's just too difficult of a project, and we can't do it. So we finally got it done, and hopefully people will enjoy the Audible version.
Very much. Gary, thanks so much, man. We appreciate you coming on.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, we will bid you adieu until next time on The Foil. Take care.
Bye.
Atonement.